I think it depends mostly on, well, obviously it depends on the type of disability, but it depends whether the disability is more strictly academic or if it's a kind of disability that influences their social behavior. You know, I think for students that academic disabilities like dyslexia or issues with numbers or physical handicaps in some way, that handicap, that disability, that difference might influence the way that they work independently, but because it doesn't really influence the way that they're interacting with others and the way they're interacting with the teacher, it doesn't really, I don't know, come up in class as much. Like, it's something I will work with them one-on-one, taking care of and, you know, coming up with accommodations for. For students that do have more social issues, and so, for example, students who are on the autism spectrum, that's something where you do see more of a difference in their day-to-day routine because, first off, you know, in the way that they handle themselves and the way they interact with others, the other students in the classroom can tell, you know, that they are different in some way. Obviously, they're not like, oh, well, they have Asperger's, they're autistic, but they can sense that difference. So all of the interactions are different, and it's more prominent.
I think that is on the disability. I think that for the most part, and I've really seen this as students there's a difference between when students come in as freshmen versus as they get used to the collaborative environment at SLA. I think in class as freshmen, some students with learning differences can really struggle at first because they can have a hard time getting into group work with other students, whereas other students might have an easier time transitioning into the social atmosphere of SLA. But I think that one of the benefits of being at SLA is over the years, students with learning differences get used to working with other students and feel more comfortable with that in classes, larger projects.
Kids with different disabilities have all sorts of ways of acting and reacting. I think for the most part, when you have children in your classes that are identified as individualized education plan learners, sometimes you don't even know. It's not obvious to the other kids in the classroom. You wouldn't know unless you got the paperwork on this kid. Their learning differences are so slight that it doesn't really make a difference how they interact socially with the other kids. Then you have your students who are further along or way heavier on the scale for, let's say, autism or things like that, and it's particularly obvious. So it really depends on what the particular learning difference is to what the actions are going to be.
Don't you like when you're free?
It depends on the content, and it depends on the disability as to whether or not they struggle more or less in class. A student with a disability in math isn't going to struggle the same way in my English class as a student with a reading or writing disability is going to struggle. But if a student has a processing disability that could bridge both math and English, then that's going to struggle. That kid's going to struggle a little bit more. But it also depends on the instruction. So if I'm changing the assignments, if I'm making sure that I'm making the content as accessible as possible across as many different ways as possible, then it should level things out quite a bit.
An interesting thing about kids with learning disabilities, or what I like to call learning differences, is that there are some instances where they are very, very successful, and even more so than your above average kids in the class. So they can think through certain problems or certain equations in different creative ways because of the way that their brain is working, or it's just a part of their brain that's working incredibly well. So I think that those things also change, and I think as a teacher it's important to keep an open mind to that the fact that there are things that learning disabled kids can do that are that make them appear to be even brighter than some of the students in the classroom without, learning disability.
At times, yes, but I think that one of the nice things about SLA, but honestly any school should do this, is that with students with disabilities, and frankly for all students, expectations should be geared towards the students. So if a student with disabilities is struggling particularly in math, then the expectations for them should be shifted. The expectations won't be the same as a student who has a 99 average all throughout math. So I think that at times they can struggle more than students without disabilities, but I think that part of the piece to helping them move beyond those struggles is adjusting expectations so that they're appropriate for every student.
In a word, I would say yes, they do struggle more, but I would say that the overall struggle with like non-disabled kids and the overall struggle with disabled kids, I think the difference is less than you would think, not more. One of the really great things to see in a classroom is students that do have learning disabilities but have really figured out how to manage them, how to work with them, how to advocate for themselves. And really, there are plenty of students where, like, yes, they have this disability or this difference on the books, but it doesn't lead to any delays in their comprehension. It doesn't lead to, them getting frustrated easily and sort of like giving up. And they can function really on the same level and complete the same level and the same amount of work as students that don't have that kind of disability on the books. So, I'd say yes, as a whole, they probably struggle a little bit more, but I don't think, and nobody should automatically assume that yes, just because you've been diagnosed with something means that it's automatically going to be harder for you. You can create a system that will, create success for you just as much as students without learning disabilities.
I think one of the things that is very important about being a student at SLA is if you do have an individualized education plan, it is made completely transparent, and you are able to read it. You are able to see what your strengths are. You are able to see what your so-called weaknesses are, and then you're able to learn ways to bridge those gaps that you have, so to speak. So there are definite teacher involvement, parent involvement, and student involvement with figuring out what the problems are and finding solutions instead of perpetuating the problems and sort of brushing them under the rug and letting them fester.
I think that it teaches them to be more resourceful in figuring out how to complete the assignments and create the same products that we do here, but because they have more freedom in how to get there, especially with project-based learning, it puts more responsibility on them to figure it out. I mean, obviously I am there to assist them and help them figure out the path that works, but ultimately, it's their path and they have to take it to the final project. I mean, whether it's something more traditional like writing a paper, whether it's creating a multimedia project, whether it's going out into the world and engaging with others. I think in a more traditional setting, when it's just a question of like worksheets and tests, it's kind of like there are the kids that can do that and there are the kids that can't. And if you're the kid that can't, you get put just sort of like in a more separate place, whether that's pull out or you don't take the test or you're in a different class. And because the kind of work we do here is more flexible and more independent, that means that kids with learning disabilities can be brought in more because it's like, oh, well, this style of learning doesn't work for you or you have an issue with that. Okay, we'll figure out another way to do this. But you're still going to be, creating the same product or sort of reaching the same end goals as the rest of the class.
Till your coffee
The SLA experience has changed the way kids with disabilities work in that it provides a lot of choice for how they're, and it also provides some kind of flexibility as a teacher. If I were teaching in a school where there was one way to assess, if there was one test that kids had to take, and you had to assess them using that test, it would be really stringent and really difficult. I think probably a little bit more restrictive in the 9th grade because students are kind of learning how we learn here at SLA, and so it's a little bit more structured or not quite as much choice is given. But I think that as we progress through 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, kids are able to show their learning in a much more diverse collection of ways.
I think that, as I said earlier, a piece that has changed is that students have really grown socially and grown in the, I've seen this with students with disabilities and without disabilities, have really grown in terms of working with other students and collaborating. It's changed me as well as a teacher because at SLA I'm working with far more students with disabilities than I had previously, so it's really given me significantly more experience in working with students with a wide variety of learning differences, and it's helped me to really adjust my own teaching style and working with those.
And your class
Kids with disabilities at SLA are, as far as I can tell, and I would imagine this is going to differ depending on what kid you ask, are part of the community and integrated. There is some, I think there are probably some students who have been identified with disabilities who their friends have no idea that they have a disability. There are some that are kind of surface disabilities that people can see and tell that that student has a disability. But as far as I can tell, those students are still fully integrated into the class process. I'm sure there's some kind of psychological pieces that are there that I'm not entirely certain how to deal with, but I think they get along pretty well here. They're certainly more connected than students with disabilities in other schools where I've taught.
I think that that's not to say that there aren't times that students with learning differences aren't isolated in class. I think that stressing collaboration as a core value really helps students with and without learning differences to get along with each other. But at the same time, there are times when, as a teacher, I've had to intervene if students are, saying things to each other or saying that they don't want to work with other people. But I'd say that that students with learning differences
It's you can't really say whether kids are gonna get along or not. There are definitely some learning disabilities that create social disabilities. Not all together always hand in hand and not always true, and these things ebb and flow. And the thing about kids too is they're growing up, they're learning about themselves, they're trying to figure out who they are. But I would say in certain instances, yes, there can be learning disabilities that keep a child isolated from other people, including the teachers and their own parents. So it really depends, again, on what that disability is and how the school embraces it.
In my experience, just what I've observed, I feel like what matters the most, and I don't think this is unique to students with learning disabilities, I think what influences how well a student gets along with others in the classroom depends on what kind of experiences they've had in previous classrooms, and whether, for whatever reason, they've either felt well integrated and well loved and like an insider, or if they felt like an outcast and like they didn't really belong. And now that can happen because of learning disabilities, and especially like if you were in a pull-out program at your previous school and you were maybe doing special ed but you weren't brought in with the rest of the school. Here we don't have a pull-out program. All kids with learning disabilities are just in the regular classes. So if that's a new experience for students, it can be very difficult. But again, like there are plenty of people who have that outcast experience or feeling at their school for entirely different reasons, right? It could be social, it could be neighborhood-based, it could be because they're of an ethnic or racial minority at their old school. So that's a place where I feel like I don't see more outsider status for students with learning disabilities. I mean, in case of like extreme learning difference, sometimes it is hard for them just to be social and have friends, but that sort of comes with the territory. So.
I do, because I think that one of the key things that their teachers and particularly Mr. Farrell is trying to teach them is self-advocacy and really self-awareness in terms of their own learning styles and what they need to do to be successful academically. So I think that after having 4 years of experience in high school working with Mr. Farrell and working with teachers on developing those skills of self-advocacy and self-awareness, they will be in a better place in terms of managing their own academics and knowing what to do. So I think any struggles they have would lessen after high school.
I'd like to think that, and not I like to think that, I know that we give all students, and especially kids with learning disabilities, a really strong base of critical thinking skills, overall core skills for future academic work. You know, I'm really confident that all students are walking out of SLA with a lot in their toolkit, like for, you know, doing studies after high school, but also just in life, you know, being able to sort of manage the world and all of the interactions you have to have. So in that way, I feel like they are better prepared. This is sort of like a happy problem to have, but I also know that like the school is so supportive and so warm and so caring for everybody. You know, in some ways I do kind of worry, like, not that we're coddling anybody or that we're being like too nice, you know, but I know that for some students it will be a little bit harder when you go out into the real world or you go to, say, like a really big university and there isn't as much of a personal connection, or at least as immediate of a connection. So I feel like for students with disabilities, the real task is to make sure that they know how to advocate for themselves, and that like they go from being a freshman when maybe they're scared or not good at that or sort of withdrawn to really becoming proactive about their own learning, so that when they do not run into trouble, but like if there are challenges or hardships or things where it's really their job to kind of take care of it and advocate for themselves, that they can. So once they're in those later situations, they will have gotten the confidence and like the core skills that they need now for later.
I think the struggles of students with disabilities will certainly change after they leave high school. I don't know that they will lessen or get greater. I think that's probably depending on the path that those students choose. I mean, there are probably some things that will highlight whatever that learning disability is, or there's some things that will it won't even affect. So I think it's probably more on an individual basis than it is on a collective basis. So I think it's really going to be case by case.
I think a child that comes out of a school like SLA will have a greater chance of success only because of the transparency that happens within the school to teach the child how to face what it is that their problem is, and then give them fixes along the way and help them to realize what those fixes are for their particular learning disability. But I think with anything else, there are personality traits that don't have to do with learning that can hold a person back or propel them forward. It depends on how much energy the person puts into really fixing or correcting or even identifying what a problem might be to enhance their life later, to make it easier to navigate their life.
I don't think my perspective is different than teachers in the classroom. I think my relationship and my work is different. Where teachers in the classroom are kind of teaching students within their subject matter, my work is primarily focused on how they learn and what they need to do differently to learn. So it's more of academic coaching and working with them on different skills that would apply to kind of all our classes across the board.
Once a time, put a time.
I'm all about kind of being really straightforward and honest with students from the beginning and explaining to them kind of what their greatest challenges are as well as their greatest, skills, and kind of combining those two things and working with them. So really breaking down for students kind of what they're really good at, and then breaking down for students what they really what their challenges are, and kind of dissecting those challenges with them and walking them through different strategies to help them. So I'm all about kind of from the beginning being honest both with what they're really good at and what they really need help with.
hurry speed.
I think a lot of our students have made tremendous growth throughout the year, and I think it's a lot of the kind of team approach, the collaboration that both our staff and students, really value. Not only have my students' reading and math scores increased, but I think the most kind of exciting thing I'm kind of happy to report is that students understand and have learned a lot about themselves and who they are as learners and kind of how they can work with others better, and kind of bring their challenges and their strengths to kind of working together. I think kind of particularly in this building where it's not like a lecture format and then you take a test 2 weeks later, the common kind of thing I'm working on with students is kind of looking at a big project, if it's a benchmark project or a smaller project, and how to go about kind of breaking down that project and the steps you have to do. Because a lot of the time, teachers are leaving it up to students to kind of manage that own work. And a lot of students that I work with need that extra help and support to kind of break things down and kind of create mini deadlines for themselves. So a lot of it's organizational and kind of time planning and management and initiating things that I'm working with.
You're out till you're looking.
In kind of the latest research, a lot of people are talking about this kind of overall umbrella thing. It's called executive functioning. So kind of skills that are not always kind of taught explicitly to students. So kind of the planning and self-initiating and organizing, all of those skills that we don't have a class on, but we're expected to know and understand in our classes. So those kind of skills is something I really work on with the students, and I've kind of seen them from September till now increase on their own with some coaching from me and other teachers.